Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and it was only a couple days ago that I was in this bin to feed it, and I had already expected to find it to be rather damp because during the previous feeding I had already observed a lot of moisture in this bin. And at that point, 2 feedings ago, I had removed the plastic covering that was helping the bin retain its moisture so none was lost through evaporation. And then during the last feeding, only a couple days ago, we had made the decision that it was probably a good idea to remove yet another layer. So this piece of cardboard that was covering up the sheet of paper that was resting on top of the material was excluded. So the fairly damp material right after feeding it was covered with only this paper over here. And then I did come down here even one more time after that to simply remove this paper and to apply this fan to be blowing air across the top of this bin, which it's been doing for a little while now. And I think it's helping, but I'm going to be away for a couple days, so I didn't want to leave this in this situation where there's just no covering and there's a fan blowing. So I'm officially shutting the fan down now, and I've decided that I'm going to switch over to another approach, which is over here. It's my supply of dry leaves, and I believe what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a whole bunch of this dry leafy material right across the top. I'm not even going to list this as a feeding, basically. I'm just going to treat this as sort of an extension of the last feeding. But the idea is that hopefully with the introduction of a whole bunch of dry material spread out across the top, the moisture that's coming out of the bin will be caught by that material and absorbed by that material. And hopefully that's going to result in the bin being a little bit more balanced in terms of the moisture level returning to where we want it to be. And I don't want to allow for excess moisture to be evaporating either. I don't want to come back in here and find that I've pushed it back over to the other extreme, which is making the contents too dry. So I believe I am going to return to covering up with this piece of cardboard at the end. So constantly trying different things, trying to make little fine minor adjustments as time goes on to see if I can get the moisture level in this bin to correct back to where I like it to be. So I'm going to put on a glove, and before we do these coverings and before we put in all this dry bedding, we're just going to take a look inside the bin to see how things are progressing with the last feeding from a few days ago and how the moisture throughout the bin is looking. So let's get a little bit closer and check out how things are progressing in here. So now, prior to activating the fan and initiating the movement of air across this material, I did do a quick stir. And you can see I didn't do a good job covering up some of the food items that were part of the last feeding. This looks like part of that block of frozen rice that was thrown in here. And I do remember some of the food items that had been placed down the middle in here as part of the last feeding getting sort of moved in and out of place. So I think we'll probably find a fair bit of food items regardless of where we check. But since in the end we're just covering up with leaves anyway, it doesn't matter so much if there's bits and pieces of food scattered across the top. So we don't have to pay too much attention today to making sure that the food is submerged. So yeah, this stuff is definitely damp, you know, way more damp than what you normally find in your worm bins. So I'm just going to start peeling back here to see how things look in the various different areas of the bin. I guess this will also give us a small view of how some of the food items in the bin are progressing after only a couple days of time. This is one of my bins that I estimate to have a population of something in the neighborhood of 5,000 worms. So I don't think it's too surprising to find worms all over the place, pretty much no matter where we look. Here's a chunk of apple, which after only a couple days is not surprising that it's still pretty much intact. And since most of the feedings, and if not, yeah, I think all of the feedings in this bin have always been applied down the middle, I'm assuming we're going to find probably the most damp stuff right in the middle. And I suppose there's probably some value in sort of stirring everything around somewhat, so that if there is very, very damp stuff, then maybe we can combine it with some stuff that's not quite as damp. So I'll see what I can do, but I'm not going to go bananas on this. I'm really just curious to see how things are looking. And then we'll get this thing covered back up as originally planned. Definitely damp no matter where you look. And also lots and lots of worms no matter where you look, that's for sure. Wow. Certain places where you reach in, it's almost just nothing but worms. It's always kind of cool when you hold a handful of worms and you can feel that entire pile that's in your hand sort of moving. The whole handful of material just moves. It's always really cool checking out a worm bin like this. Here's another, we already found a couple of these and I've placed them over here to the side. Mango seeds. We did try placing various chunks of paper in here in the hopes that they'd help absorb some of the moisture in here. So hopefully they're helping a little bit as well. This is that we had placed a moldy hard roll in here, half of a hard roll actually. The other bin that I'm maintaining in tandem with this one received the other half of it. What I could do is, if anyone's interested in seeing what both of those bins look like, this bin as well as the other bin that's being maintained in tandem with it, I could put a link in the corner for that last feeding so you could see how the other bin looks, because the other bin is the way I think both of these bins should look from a moisture perspective. But in that bin too, you could see that it's just as heavily populated as this one. So it is pretty exciting feeding to watch if you're interested in checking it out. So we've already inspected more or less half of what's here. I had touched on this in previous videos, talking about some of the stuff that I've been pulling up off the bottom. A lot of this leafy material. I've not had leaves down here in my wormery for a couple weeks now. I ran out. I was trying to deplete a supply of shredded paper that I had down here, so that's what I was using for bedding most recently. So I'm glad that I've got a replenished supply of leaves down here now again, which is what we're going to use today. But it does also seem like I'm not finding many traces of that paper that was used as bedding underneath the feedings. Kind of makes me wonder if in fact that's what these worms might be craving, is that supply of carbon. Maybe I do need to apply more carbon-rich bedding type materials when I feed. Because if I'm not seeing any in here, or very little of it, then maybe they've already gone through it and that was what they were more interested in than these delicious food items that I put in here. I mean, granted, a couple of these paper items that I placed in here are still in here and intact, but I'm not really seeing any signs of the white shredded copy paper, printer paper that I had placed in here, making me wonder if that was possibly consumed already. So I'm just coming up on all kinds of different things. This looks like a banana stem. This looks like a banana peel. The other thing that I had in my hand earlier is the stem of a pumpkin. So you can see there's a whole variety of different types of food items that have been placed in here over time. Some of the items are probably things that would get consumed pretty rapidly, and other things will probably take a considerable amount of time. This is a piece of cabbage leaf. And I think we're not going to see much of the rice, but here's a little chunk of it, still somewhat intact. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to keep intact since it's not frozen together anymore, and it's just going to flake apart if we touch it. Pretty awesome though, looking through this bin. Everywhere you look, there's just tons and tons of worms. It's always fun messing around inside of a really heavily populated worm bin. I think as we continue moving our way across, maybe one thing we can do, as long as we're down here in the middle, is maybe restore what the feeding area was like last time we fed, which was just a feeding zone applied right down the center. So I've more or less collected all the food items that were part of the last feeding and some leftovers from previous feedings. So I'm thinking I'm going to just grab a couple handfuls of leaves, nice dry leaves. Ooh, that's quite a bit actually, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. I think it's actually just what we need. I'm going to go ahead and start returning some of these food items back down to the middle. So here's that piece of bread. Right next to it is the piece of rice. I believe that's the way we left it, so that we might be able to actually run into them again and see how they're progressing. Alright, I think we've got most of the food items that we encountered along the way back in the feeding area. And there's really no significance to the center. There's no huge advantage to feeding down the middle. Some people actually move the feeding area in their bin from place to place to place throughout the entire life cycle of the bin, giving the worms a chance to check out various sections of the bin in pursuit of the food, the most newly added food supplies, which is something I've considered trying again. I've done it in the past, but I've just kind of gotten into the habit of feeding down the middle. Gosh, over here too, look at all these worms. Sometimes I do wonder about my numeric estimate of 5,000 in these bins. Sometimes when you just start seeing them and how many there are, it's just it's hard to imagine how many there really are in here. I would definitely have to say that 5,000 has got to be at least close. Sometimes it even makes me wonder if it's actually shy of the true numbers in here. So I'm just moving some of the worms that I encounter as we're picking around down here right on top of the feeding area. I'm also trying to move up some of the more damp stuff I'm finding at the very bottom. Bring it up closer to the surface. Okay, so I'm just wondering if we could use some of this stuff from this side to begin leveling things off. Sometimes I wonder what this bin might be like if I were to just forget about it for a month and come back later. I'd be worried, I think. You know, I'd be worried that they depleted the entire supply of food in here and that they'd be starting to become restless and hungry. So I don't know if I dare do anything like that. I've always felt like a bin that's this heavily populated does need periodic check-ins just to make sure it's not running amok or depleting its supply of stuff that it needs. So that's pretty interesting. I'm at this point really just trying to level things off to a certain degree. It does seem like the center of the bin is running a little bit higher up than the rest. And there's still chunks of food pretty near the surface, but like I said earlier, I don't think that's really a problem. You can see as I mat the material down here how gooey and sticky and wet it is. I believe that as the worms start to come up and start to break through that top flattened out surface, the whole top of the bin will start becoming nice again. So maybe next time we come in here we can just scrape off the leaves that I'm going to cover everything up with and see if we can find maybe a fresh layer of castings in here. I don't really know what to expect. But I do feel like it's probably a good next step to just, you know, go ahead and apply a whole generous supply of leaves right across the top. And I guess the hope is that the material is going to allow some of its moisture to collect within these dry leaves and hopefully balance things out a little bit. But if my hunch is correct, then maybe the worms in here are also going to be drawn to the rich carbon source. Because I didn't really see any signs of the white paper bedding that had been placed underneath the feeding area. So it makes me wonder if the worms are in need of a little bit more carbon in their diet. And if they are in need of it, then this will be a nice supplement to what they've gotten so far. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I've pretty much emptied about half of this box out, and I did have it packed pretty tight in here. So this is a pretty generous supply of leaves. I guess I could even use some of these dry leaves to give myself a little dry hand rinsing over here. Try to leave some of the castings in the bin rather than rinsing them off when I wash my glove later. So another idea I had in terms of covering things up here when we're done was to restore plastic coverings again to really help the moisture in the bin stay in the bin and gets captured by the leaves, and helps dampen the leaves nicely. But I just really wanted to go, little increments here, so I didn't want to swing right back to trying to preserve the moisture that much. But I think by placing this cardboard back on top, it should really help keep some of the moisture in there and help those leaves that we just placed in there capture some of the moisture as it starts to exit the more damp castings down below. But that sure is fun to see. That should be an interesting thing to check in on next time we come in here to see how this bin's progressing. But that's it for today. I just really felt like I needed to tend to this bin and address the moisture somehow, and this seemed to me like a very good idea. Hopefully you agree. I'd love to hear people's ideas in terms of what you guys think. What would you have done if it was your bin and you were trying to tend to the excess moisture? But hopefully you'll agree that this is a good next step, and I guess we'll only see when we come back in here next time to feed or to check in on it and see how things are progressing. So let me get things around here cleaned up and put away, but I won't bore you with that. Let me just take this as a quick opportunity to say thanks for watching. I really appreciate your company, and if you enjoyed the video, hopefully you did, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Take care. Bye now.